There's something that nobody's talking about right now, and yet in this prophetic and powerful conversation with George Barna, he hit the nail on the head. The phrase is Christian invisibility. Do you understand what that means? It means that we have churches on every street corner, but we are not seeing a nation shaken. And I believe in this eye-opening interview, George is going to give you some stunning information that's going to tell you why we are in the state that we're in and how we can shift things. Don't go away. Larry Sparks here with Voice of Destiny, and I am so thrilled to have somebody on the program. I have followed their work for years, and they are absolutely essential in the body of Christ. I'm speaking about none other than George Barna. George, it is a joy to have you on the show here on Voice of Destiny.
Thank you.
I want to talk about your new book because, listen, Destiny Image is a publishing house. We publish prophetic books.
Right.
I believe your book is very prophetic in a sense, called Raising Spiritual Champions. There is a generation right now, there is a war over our children. There is a war when it comes to even the teaching they're getting and what they're being educated in. I want to ask you, what motivated you at this moment to release Raising Spiritual Champions?
As you can tell by looking at me, and if you follow my work, I'm getting old. And so I thought, I really want to finish well. However much time the Lord gives me still, I want to make sure that I put out things before I pass away that really make a difference, that can really help the kingdom. And when I looked at all the different things that I know about what's going on today, what's going on in the church, outside the church, in our society, thought, if we don't raise children up to be spiritual champions, the church is going to fade away in America. I recently put something out where I talked about what we're facing today is an era of Christian invisibility in America.
Wow.
Because we're getting down to the point where in anybody's circle of friends and influence, there are so few true disciples of Jesus in America today, and it's on the decrease from generation to generation, that we're approaching that period of time where the average American in their circle of friends and influence will not have a single Christian in that circle.
Wow.
And so as they're making their decisions, God's truth principles are not going to be even in the conversation. How pathetic and sad is that?
Well, let me ask you this question, because we're talking about Christian invisibility. That's a startling phrase, because I'm thinking to myself, I live in Dallas. There are churches everywhere, mega churches, tens of thousands of people. But one thing I'm noticing as somebody who travels and speaks and ministers, there's a lot of pulpits that are sidestepping issues of truth, issues that particularly deal with a lot of the social things we're navigating right now. And even when it comes to what you're talking about, discipleship, it seems like we want to get people into our buildings and into our meetings, but I don't know if we're seeing robust disciples being raised up. So that's very strange.
Two things I've found in the research that relate to that. Number one is that when we interviewed a national representative sample of pastors of churches and asked them, do you think your church is effective in ministry? More than 8 out of 10 of them said, absolutely, no question about it. Like, great. How do you know that? What are the things that you look at to suggest to you that you're effective? We found that pastors measure 5 things to determine if they're effective in ministry. How many people show up? How many programs they offer?
Wow.
How many staff people they've hired? How much money they raise? And how much square footage they built out on the campus? I'm a measurement guy, so I'm glad they're measuring things. But as a measurement guy, I know that you get what you measure.
Mm-hmm.
So if all you're measuring is size and buildings and whatnot, that's what you're going to be producing. Jesus didn't die for any of those 5 things.
He did not.
So if we measured those 5 things, what would they relate to? Discipleship.
Yeah.
So in writing this book, Raising Spiritual Champions, I read dozens of discipleship books before I started writing my book, because I wanted to make sure that I've got my head on straight.
Yeah.
And one of the things that shocked me, because I was looking for it, is that nobody had talked about the 6 times when Jesus himself said, you will be my disciple if, or you cannot be my disciple unless. There's 6 times, John 8, John 13, John 15, and Luke 14. He's got 3 times when he says that. And so I took those 6 criteria that Jesus said, we did a survey with that to find out, according to Jesus' criteria, how many disciples are there in America?
Yeah.
We're looking at 3%.
Wow.
the adult population. So when we talk about what churches are doing to raise disciples, they're not focused on that. They're focused on bringing people in the doors, getting money, offering programs, hiring people to run the programs, building more buildings so they can have more programs and staff.
Let me ask you this question. What does a disciple look like when you're talking about even just some of the expressions or characteristics of a modern 21st century disciple of Jesus? What are some of the things that you would say are non-negotiable when it comes to
Well, I'd have to go back to what Jesus said. I mean, who cares what I think?
Well, exactly.
You know, what Jesus said, you know, in John 8, he talked about how you will be my disciples if you obey my teachings. So consistent obedience is critical. In John 13, he talked about you'll be my disciples if you love other people. So love is critical. John 15, he said, you'll be my disciples if you produce much spiritual fruit.
Wow.
That is the Great Commission. Go out and make disciples. That's the kind of fruit he's talking about. Luke 14, first he talked about you cannot be my disciple, essentially, unless you love God more than anything and anyone else in your life. He went on from there a couple verses later. He said, you cannot be my disciple unless you're willing to carry your cross for me. And by that, what he meant is you surrender to my agenda.
Yeah.
It's about what my calling is for your life, not what you want to do, not what other people are asking you to do. It's about my calling to you. And then finally, at the end of Luke 14, said, you cannot be my disciple unless you surrender everything to follow me and to be my disciple.
Yeah.
So those are the things that we're looking for. People, you can't obey the scriptures unless you study the scriptures. You have to know them first.
Very true.
So, you know, you say, what are some of the marks of a disciple? You got to be studying the Bible all the time.
Yep.
You have to be completely sold out to avoiding sin. You can't avoid temptation, but you can avoid sin.
Very true.
You got to be looking all the time for how can I love other people? Genesis 12 principle, you've been blessed to be a blessing. So always looking for ways to take what God has given to me, give it to other people in the name of Christ. Those are the kinds of things that you look for.
Well, and finishing up, you know, I think of why our nation in America is in the state that it is, and I can't help but think, based on the criteria you're presenting that Jesus gave for what a disciple looks like, we might have people who are alleged followers of Jesus, but you wonder if our churches were filled with disciples, if our nation would look different, if our children would look different.
Completely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I mean, in America today, you got 66% who call themselves Christians, 34% who meet a theological criteria for being born again, but only 4% have a biblical worldview. Only 3% of adults are disciples. So,
my goodness.
Yeah, there's a big gap.
Well, I want to encourage you guys, Raising Spiritual Champions. I know it's aimed at the next generation, but candidly, as I'm talking to George Barna about this is a book that all of us need to really give us a picture. What does it look like to be a disciple of Jesus? And I believe if we follow these ancient principles that Jesus gave us, we will see the fruitfulness come out of the church that I believe is his will, and then we will see nations start to shift. So, George, thank you so much for being with us today, sir.
Great to be here.
Such a great book, and it's so timely.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you.